after 30, 40 years of teaching Marx, of reading Marx, do you not get bored of it? Or is there always something new that you're learning? Is the thinking that deep and that important?
Well, one of the great things about Marx is he's a very complex writer, and so you're always finding new wrinkles in what he's doing. But the other thing is, of course, the world is changing.
New ideas.
When I was teaching. What Marx shows is that the closer you get to a free market capitalism, and a competitive free market capitalism, the greater the level of inequality that will be experienced. And this was contrary to what Adam Smith suggested, because Adam Smith suggested that the more you organized a market society, the more that society would develop in a way that would be of benefit to all. But what Marx showed was, no, it's not going to benefit all, it's going to benefit the capitalist class, and it's going to make conditions worse. For much and I think right now what you've got is you've got populations who are deeply alienated. Now, alienation is a good Marxist term. It talks about the way in which workers are alienated from their labor. It talks about how we're alienated from nature. It talks about how we're alienated from the conditions of daily life. We're alienated from political process, which says it's supposed to be democratic, but we know damn well we don't have anything to say about anything. So there's a tremendous alienation in society right now. And I think that tremendous alienation creates a massive population that is seething with anger and seething with the requirement that somebody say something about, address this question of alienation. And it's at that point that somebody like myself can come in and say, well, look, I think there's a reason to try to explain this alienation. I'm not the only one who can say these things, because, and there are many other sources of alienation, because there are forms of racial domination and gender domination. There are issues of that kind as well. So, you know, it's at that point where it seems to me that the academic can step in and do something. I don't think we lead, I think we follow. And I think why my interpretation of Marx, I think, is possibly being more influential now in academic circles, is because I've always been interested in urbanization, and I've always been questioned about urban daily life and uneven geographical development. In other words, I'm interested in what's going on the ground. And my Marx is the Marx who helps me explain what's going on the ground. Whereas a lot of Marxists are interested in the theory as theory, work with the theory as theory, and have a hard time relating it to the ground.
Okay, so for the rest of the interview, we'll be talking about a lot of the things that Marx got right, or we think he got right.
Yeah.
What did he get wrong?
Oh, well, I wouldn't say he's got things wrong so much as he left so much unfinished. It's annoying. Intensely annoying, because he gets halfway into something and he leaves it aside. He also made a lot of assumptions in his studies, and he assumed away certain kind of questions. For example, he's fully aware that our alienated relation to nature is problematic under capitalism, and that capitalism is very destructive towards our, the natural environment, and he understands those things. But the amount of time he spent talking about this was kind of minuscule. And I think that he says basically, oh, it's critically important. We know that capital survives by destroying its sources of wealth and the environment. But then he leaves it at that. So there's an incompleteness in his work, and I think that that's one of the things that those of us who work in that tradition have an obligation to try to complete what he's saying. And of course there is some very good work now on Marx and environmental questions. Just take, for example, the production of wants, needs and desires. I mean, in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx sort of, particularly in the third chapter, he says, well, commodities are in love with money, but, being Shakespearean, he says, but the course of true love never did run smooth. And so he then gets into this whole debate about how new wants, needs and desires get created, and he deals with that in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. He deals with it in the Grundrisse as well. And when you think about it, you say, well, we suddenly find ourselves it's absolutely necessary I have a cell phone. Absolutely necessary. It becomes a necessity. In 5-10 years, there was a time when we lived without cell phones. And now, it's very difficult to live without them. So you create a world. And of course, then what happens is you get new models of cell phones. So actually consumerism is being picked up and transformed very fast. So everything becomes obsolete. you know, when I actually first got into it, and you know, I've been in it a long time, if you did, you know, maybe 2 books in a lifetime, you were considered to being a bit pushy. Now, if you don't publish a book every year, you know, and you have publishers breathing down your neck saying, where's the next book? And if you don't publish a book every other year, people think you died, you know, and so there's a tremendous pressure to sort of accelerate everything. And the result is life is very tense, and alienation comes in a lot too, because we don't get time to enjoy ourselves. I mean, the studies of pre-capitalist societies show that in some of those societies the working day was 4 hours. So the insanity. I mean, the insanity of a lot of this is I think real pressing right now, and I think that every mode of production creates a personality to go with it. I mean, you know, the Italian communist Gramsci talked about American and Fordism, and he talked about the typical Fordist worker, who's a different kind of human being from the artisan laborer. And of course now we're down to, you know, the flexible specialization and precarious labor, and we have a different personality that goes with it. And everything is temporary, and everything's ephemeral, and everything is moving very, very fast. And it creates psychological stresses, and it creates alienations. And I think that society right now needs to sort of step back and think about, well, is this the right way to go? Is this the kind of people we want to be? And there is a debate going on about that. It's very interesting being in the United States. I mean, some of it's very moralizing. People kind of say, well, if the persona of the future is Donald Trump, do we really want to be like that? Is that the kind of human being we want to be? And a lot of people are saying, no, it's not. This is not who we are as Americans. I mean, there's a little phrase coming up again and again and again, and some of it is all sort of hot air and moralizing, but I think there's a real profound sense that our species being is being transformed into something which is rather ugly. And the authoritarian personality is coming out, and we're seeing kind of the neo-fascist stuff come up, and, you know, so I think there's a whole, and it's all connected, and this is one of the things I think that we academics can try and do, is to sort of pinpoint some of these connections and say that, yeah, there's depression, there's alienation, but look at the context in which this is occurring. Maybe we should change that context, and that would relieve some of the pressure which is on you psychologically.
So I want to return to the issue of attention, the new economy, psychology in a second. But let's talk about debt. And this is something you talk about extensively in the new book. It's beyond dispute that we have record levels of household debt, financial sector debt, banks and so on, and sovereign debt with nations. Why is that? Why is everybody in more debt, more or less, than ever before?
I think it has to do with the need to keep the system expanding. Capital is about growth. It has to grow at 3% a year, and that's a compound rate of growth, which means that it's actually going to accelerate over time and become faster and faster. It's got to do that, and the only way it can do that is by actually discounting the future into the present. And the way you do that is you issue debt. And debt is a claim on future labor. So what it is if you're in debt to me, then you've got to work it off. And so what we're doing to students and others, putting them in debt, is putting them in situations where they have to work it off. And that means the freedom of choice disappears. And this is what I call anti-value, being mobilized by capital to make sure that value gets produced. So corporations are in debt. They've got to get paid off, and so they've got to go into production, or they've got to go into activity somehow or other to find enough money to pay off their debt. So the acceleration of debt has a lot to do with the fact that the only way in which capital can satisfy its requirement of a 3% growth rate forever is by increasing the money supply and increasing the money that's available. And one of the ways in which you do that is to issue more debt. And in effect, we've got into what's called a kind of Ponzi economy, where we borrow a lot of money this year to pay off our last year's debt. And then we pay even more money next year to pay off this year's debt. So the sort of the piling up of debt right now. And I think it's very interesting that Mexico, when it got into debt in 1982, I think it got into debt with about 80 or 90% of the debt was 80 or 90% of GDP, and this was considered catastrophic. Now the whole world is in debt to the tune of something like 225 or 240% of the world's GDP.
And that there was a new, almost revolutionary subject. Antonio Negri talks about this. A lot of the Italian guys talk about this. The cognitariat.
Right.
Is cognitive capitalism a new kind of capitalism, or is it just a load of nonsense? Does Marx explain the contemporary composition of work and its relationship to technology?
Well, I think that knowledge is obviously a very important feature of any capitalist production system, and the free gifts of human history and the creation of knowledge are crucial to the functioning of capital. So one would not say that knowledge is irrelevant. But as far as Marx is concerned, it's a free good. I mean, we don't pay a royalty every time we appeal to, Newton's theory of gravitation, or something like that, or other engineering findings. I mean, this is all a free good. What Marx does say, however, is that when knowledge gets incorporated in the machine, then the need for knowledge on the part of the worker disappears. So that, in a sense, the worker can become, more or less a trained gorilla or a zombie or whatever you want. And so the conditions of labor are likely to become less and less attractive. And beyond that, the fewer laborers may be employed in productive activity. So Marx does say that, look, there's an interesting problem here. But when you start to look at some of the countervailing forces in this, that the expansion of the labor force in some areas which are low productivity has been very remarkable under capitalism, but we just don't recognize them because they're not in factories. We can't go to a factory and say, there's the working class. I sort of talk about, I stand on the corner of 86th Street and 2nd Avenue in New York. And what do I see? I see lots of restaurants around. Well, making hamburgers. Why is that not value creating as opposed to making automobiles? But if you look at all the little, the hamburger stores and little places making soups and coffee and all this kind of stuff, this is very productive activity. But it's a different kind of productive activity, and it's labor intensive. And so we've got a lot of labor-intensive activities going, developing, which are very hard to turn into high productivity, automated thing. Now, artificial intelligence maybe can come in. It may be that I'll be able to go to one of these places and press a button and say I want a hamburger, and some, and it'll come out the other end. Who knows? There are those real possibilities, but I don't think that cognitive. The cognitive side of things is in itself productive of value. I think that it's very important as a condition for the production of value that we have knowledge available, but the incorporation of knowledge in the machine is itself a very specific aspect of what the cognitive capitalists should be talking about, which are not. I mean, after all, if knowledge in itself was value creating, we'd all be sitting around just creating knowledge, and any old kind of article about this and any old novel about that, and they say, hey, I've made value, and then of course at some point or other somebody's going to say, well, what's the exchange value of it? And everybody kind of says, well, this is a load of crap you're writing, nobody wants to read this. I mean, why?
I'm interested to know what your take is on this, because it seems to me quite remarkable that even today the most important piece of fixed capital are these, right?
Yeah.
And I've got a PhD, I've been in education for 25 years, and yet capitalism has given me one of these things which makes me bloody useless, and it completely undermines all of that work. So what's your explanation for that? Because, I mean, for me, if you're thinking about capitalism as a system which is trying to create more value, generate greater outputs, it seems a contradiction which I can't quite grasp.
Well, I guess there's almost a classic way to look at this from Marx's perspective, which is that on the one hand, capital should be producing more and more value. because it needs to do that in order to guarantee its future expansion. The measure of value is money. Can you expand the money without expanding the value? Does money betray value? And I think there's a strong case right now to say that money is betraying value. And it's interesting that I was reading some China stuff the other day, and the Chinese understand it this way, that on August the 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. After that, there was no discipline behind global finance. And then the question arises, well, what's world money when we've lost gold? The US managed to get that, and here I put in some of my own stuff, that it managed to make sure that the dollar became the standard for the world. And it did it in a couple of ways. One was it went to Saudi Arabia that had all this, the surplus oil, and had a lot of money sloshing around, and said basically you've got to recycle that money inside of the United States. And so all of the oil money came back to the investment bankers in New York City, and the investment bankers got to play with it. The second thing was they said to the Saudis, you only write the oil contracts in dollars, not in any other currency. And that meant that the petrodollar, as it were, became the global currency at the time. And then people could start playing with it. And currencies were moving around, and then people could start to make money off, the currency movements. The famous one was George Soros betting against the British pound in the exchange rate mechanism in 1992. And he borrowed billions, and he bought Deutschmarks, and then the pound gets devalued, and he then converts the Deutschmarks back into pounds, and of course he's made over £1 billion in 3 days. Okay, well this is a fantastic sort of way to make money.
Where do I sign?
And yeah, when you tell somebody this, everybody says, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea." But then the Chinese looking at this kind of thing are saying, "Well, actually, right now, money is being made in the West mainly through mechanisms of this kind." And this is what the main players in the West are doing. They're not actually interested in making things anymore. They're interested in playing the financial markets and coming out that. And then the Chinese kind of say, look what happened in Southeast Asia. Actually, what happened in Southeast Asia was that the credit system suddenly froze up, and people couldn't borrow anything. So liquidity was denied. Companies went bankrupt. All over the place, and the banks and the financial institutions from Japan and the United States and Europe went in and bought up all the companies at dirt prices. Then they release the liquidity, then the economy recovers, then you sell them back at a huge amount. And basically what the Chinese say was, what the US and everybody's been doing is actually robbing the rest of the world of value by these monetary gains. By playing these monetary things, and they couldn't do that if you had a stable currency behind it, which was the gold. So being off the gold standard has been crucial to be able to rob the world of value, and this is the Chinese view. And then the Chinese kind of say, look what's happened, and it's not the country that does it, it's not the US that does it, it's the bankers who do it. All of the benefits go, and I point about this in this. All the benefits go to a certain class. And that's how the rich have got incredibly richer in this point, is by raiding the world of value through these financial manipulations. And then the Chinese kind of say, look, after East and Southeast Asia, they did Brazil, they did Argentina, they did Russia, and then of course they did Greece. When really, everybody's been doing this, and they said, we're next. They're going to raid us in China, but we're not going to open our capital markets.
Finally. There's no mention of socialism or communism in the book. Certainly not communism.
Right.
Now, clearly, I know that for many people that has negative connotations. Yeah. But Marx is quite clear. He puts communism in counterpoint to capitalism and all the things we've discussed, production for exchange, commodities, and so on. He says that this will no longer exist in communism. And in Capital 3, I think it is, he says that capitalism, as with all historic society, is a condition of necessity, a state of necessity, and that communism is a state of freedom, which I read as essentially post-scarcity.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the limits of capitalism, you have in this book and your previous books, for years now. And I know that there's a history of this on the left. Marx says, you know, my job isn't to write the recipes for the cookshops of the future. But are we not at a moment where that is quite important now?
I think the way I would approach this is, again, go back to sort of daily life considerations and start to talk about processes of what I would call revolutionary reforms, which is, you know, the idea that we can all storm some, I don't know, the Federal Reserve Bank and change the world. You know, I just don't think that's feasible. And right now, the capitalist state apparatus has such powers of domination and repression available to it, and militarization. It seems to me that, you know, some sort of street revolt is not going to make it, which is, I think street demonstrations are going to be very helpful, but a kind of
storming the Winter Palace
is not going to work. So I think about revolutionary reforms, and I think that you can start with a simple kind of process and say, look, over the last 40 years, we've seen an increasing intensification of the commodification of education. We have to reverse that. We have to decommodify education for everyone. And that's a tangible kind of thing, and it's a feasible kind of thing, actually, when people could look at it. We have to do the same with healthcare. We have to try and do as much as we can on that for housing, because housing is a right, and right now it's, you know. So in other words, we want to maximize the delivery of use values on education, healthcare, housing, and it has to be outside of the commodity kind of rationing. We should do the same with basic foodstuffs. A basic diet package foodstuff should be free for everybody. This would be great, because actually the wastage in the food system right now is huge. 40% of the food in the United States goes to waste.